All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Guy Royce. I'm the self-proclaimed czar of the Columbus JavaScript user group. And well, this is ColumbusJS. Tonight, we've got TJ VanToll. I said your name right correctly?
Yep.
It's an easier one, but I just wanted to be sure. I thought
Yep.
It's always best to check after you say it, right? So he's got a talk tonight for us called What Web Developers Can Learn from Native Mobile Developers. So we're going to go ahead and give him the floor. But before we do, I just want to explain to everyone that's on stream or is watching these YouTube videos later how this is going to work. So if you've got questions, just go ahead and drop them in chat on Twitch, and then I'll read them and make sure that TJ gets them. If you've got questions and you're in the Zoom here with everyone else, just go ahead and just ask TJ. We got a fairly small group of people in the Zoom. If you're on Twitch and you want to join the Zoom, you can go out to meetup.com and get the URL to join the Zoom as well. And if you're watching this on YouTube afterwards, leave a question in the comments, I guess, and I will try to watch those and let TJ know that there's a question. So, and with that, welcome very much, TJ. The floor is yours.
Yeah, awesome. So thanks for inviting me. It's a lot of fun. So my name is TJ. I work as a developer advocate for a company called Progress, and I'll explain a little bit more of what I do and how I got here throughout this talk. So first of all, I should let you know that I'm a little disappointed that I'm not in Columbus, because I didn't mention to all of you this before, but I have been to Columbus several times, and I do like your city quite a bit. But I also have to let you know that I absolutely hate your football team, like with a passion, very deep down in here. So I'm sure you are all fine people. I'm not going to hold any of this against you, but I can't just not get this out there. Just been living in Michigan all my life. I do not like when the Buckeyes win, and they've been doing a little bit too much of that recently. But I don't want to rant about Ohio State for the entire time. I want to talk today about what native, or basically what web developers can learn from iOS and Android developers. So basically, I am a longtime web developer. I spent a lot of time, 5-6 years of my career, working in iOS and Android land. And I think web and JavaScript developers can actually learn a bit about the native development stack. And so that's what I'm going to be covering today. And specifically, how I'm going to do this is I'm going to start by giving you a little bit of my background, how I came here, just to set some context for the meat of this talk, which is really just going to be a handful of tips that I have, just things that I think your average person working with JavaScript, working with the web can use, can put into practice for their day-to-day work. And as Guy mentioned, if you have any questions, just feel free at any point to bring them up. I can handle anything else that comes up at the end, but we can handle them just as we're going through this. But I want to start by just telling you sort of where I'm coming from for this entire conversation. And for me, my story begins back when I was in high school. And I found this picture. I look like I'm 9 feet tall in this picture for whatever reason. And you see that I'm already a fan of Michigan, so I hated Ohio State already at this age. And I was also, as you might expect, very cool, very popular kid. So in my free time, I was building sites for places like GeoCities and AngelFire. Like, I got really addicted to this. So if you remember the awful websites of like the late 90s, I was behind probably a couple of these with like autoplay music and all those things. And these are actual websites that I built. So these weren't just like random things I found on the web. These are like real things that I did. And I became a really big fan of the web. Like that was my introduction to programming. That's how I'm here today. And crazily enough, I found that actually people will pay you money to do this. Like I got kind of lucky, right? The web was my passion, and all of a sudden JavaScript and the web just took off. And so all of a sudden I was the same young kid, apparently now a Toronto Raptors fan, but the web had sort of kickstarted my career and kind of led to where I am today. And so from there, I got involved with the jQuery project. I just got super into the web. If you've used jQuery UI before, I was on that team for a couple of years. So if you use that project, you've probably dealt with some code that I was involved with for a while. I wrote a book on jQuery UI. This is basically my long way of saying that the web is sort of my introduction to programming. It's really my thing I'm passionate about. which is interesting because in my current job, about probably 6 years ago at this point, my boss came to me and said, TJ, how would you like to be involved in this new sort of experimental project we have going on called Nativescript? And what made Nativescript interesting is it's actually not a project for building for the web at all. So it was kind of a sharp change in direction for me, but it's actually a technology for working with iOS and Android. And the sort of caveat or trick to this is that Nativescript lets you use JavaScript for building for iOS and for Android. And the specifics of this aren't really all that important. If you're familiar with React Native, Nativescript is extremely similar to what React Native does. You're using JavaScript and you're building for iOS and Android. I mentioned this though because I decided to do it. It seemed like an interesting, innovative project. And because of that, I spent basically 5 full years working in Android and iOS. So working with native app developers, seeing what makes native apps work or fail, things that these platforms do well, things that these platforms don't do well. And after those 5 years, I decided to come back to the web. So nowadays I work on what's called Kendo UI at Progress. I'm back sort of in web land, but I've taken a lot of the lessons that I learned from my time on iOS and on Android back over to, oh, there we go. I froze up for a second. Back over to the web. And these are the tips that I sort of want to share with you today. Just sort of pragmatic things that I think every developer, really any developer at all, but especially any web developer can learn from what these native mobile platforms do best. And so I have 4 tips. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to list them out for you. And then we're going to go through them sequentially in detail. Like I said, if you have any questions or you want to chat about any of this at any time, feel free to speak up. But the 4 quick tips are, my first one is that list scrolling performance I consider to be extremely important. So think of flicking through a list on like Facebook, Twitter, something like that. My second one is that testing on real physical devices matters. So actually holding like the app in your hand on mobile is a really big deal. I'm going to encourage you to use animations more in the apps that you build, just because I think native apps do a better job of this than web apps in general. And finally, minimize asset download, so ship less code. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean when I get to that point. Like I said, I want to go through these sequentially. So let's start with from the top and talk about list scrolling performance. And this, I consider this my most important tip, and I put it on the top of my list, because if you think about it, just think about the apps that you use on your phone all the time. A whole lot of them are nothing more than giant lists. So think Facebook, Twitter, Discord, Slack, Teams. I'll switch just to avoid giving people seizures of the list, but a whole giant component of the apps that we use in our day-to-day lives are nothing more than giant lists, or at least the list is the cornerstone of the apps. So there's a lot of reasons to make a list that works really well. The first is just from a user experience perspective. As a user, you want that interaction to be really smooth and fluid. But there's also some business reasons as well. If you think from the perspective of like a Reddit or a Twitter or a Facebook, apps that, for example, show ads in their feed, well, if users can get through the list faster, that means they engage more with the apps. That means they see more advertisements. They're more likely to click on those advertisements. So the better that list performs, the happier their users are going to be, and essentially the more money that they're going to make. So with this context in mind, this app I have here is one of the first examples I tended to show people that were new to Nativescript. So if they want to build an iOS and Android app, I'd show them that, hey, in Nativescript, you can build this app with about 20 lines of code. Look a little something like this. Now, don't worry too much about the syntax here. I'm not here to try to teach you exactly what Nativescript does. Really, all this is doing is just saying, generate 100,000 numbers and just toss them in a control that we call the list view, and it would render the app that you're seeing here behind the screen. And the reason this made for such a good demo is you can see the actual performance of this list is buttery smooth. Like I could just take the phone and just flick through it, and this app would have absolutely no problem handling this. And the reason for this is actually nothing to do with Nativescript. In Nativescript, really all we were doing was delegating to underlying native APIs. So Android has this widget that's built in called a recycler view, and iOS has one called a UI table view. And what these APIs do is they essentially just make good lists for you. Like they handle the trickier part of building these really big UIs, like memory management. So if you toss a ton of data in a list, it knows to only load the parts that the user is seeing and sort of offload the rest until the user scrolls them into view. And the reason I consider this a big deal is because if you've ever tried to do anything like this on the web, you will learn very quickly that the web does not have an API that's anything like this. So for example, if you just went to the web, you went to build with any tool whatsoever, and you just created a UL, this is essentially the equivalent of what I'm trying to do in Nativescript, and you just said, let's add 100,000 LIs to this, what could happen, right? Because this is more or less the exact equivalent code of what I tried to do with Nativescript for iOS and Android. And if you try to do this, your desktop browser can probably handle this. We've, at least for me, like I'm giving this talk off a high-end MacBook Pro. It's got a pretty good processor. It could handle this app fairly decently. But if you tried this on a mobile device, for instance, I loaded this. I've got a fairly high-end iPhone 11 here that I tried to load this on, and it took a bit for it to just load this list with 100,000 items. And when it did, you can see when I try to scroll, I don't have that buttery smooth experience. It's sort of choppy and laggy, and it doesn't feel the greatest. And again, this is on a pretty modern phone. As you imagine, as you go back in time to older devices and worse hardware, this experience gets quite a bit worse. And it's because the web doesn't have anything like its UI table view or a Android.widget.recycler view. Essentially, developers are left on their own to try to solve this problem and try to build a really good list experience, which doesn't mean you can't do it. So I get sort of obsessed by this, and I sort of dig into, when I see these things on the web, I dig into how they work. And what I consider to be the best mobile list, at least that I've found so far, is Twitter has a really excellent implementation. So even if you want to multitask right now, if you go to mobile.twitter.com and you just start like flicking through things, you'll see that the browser implementation of it is really quite good. It's not quite as smooth as native, but it feels really smooth as you interact with it. And the reason for this, if you actually dig into their implementation, so on this GIF, you'll see that I am scrolling through a list of tweets really quickly, and a whole bunch of them are on the screen. But in my actual DOM, I only have a certain number of divs. So each div that appears here corresponds to a tweet. And you'll see that Twitter isn't creating more and more divs as I scroll up this list. Instead, it's reusing these DOM elements and essentially doing some math on this div to make sure those divs are essentially cycling what the user sees. And I actually find this is a blog post I found from LogRocket. And I like this because, and I'll link to these slides later if you want to follow up on any of these links, but they really nailed this GIF because I think it does a better job than me just trying to do this, virtually trying to show how it works. But basically, if you minimize your DOM structure, because that's what really slows down the browser, you can get this performant experience on the web without getting that sort of chuggy experience that happens when you throw a lot of DOM nodes in there. So this blog from LogRocket goes into the implementation in a lot more detail than I'm going to have time for today. The other good thing is that there are a lot of implementations out there, depending on what tech stack you happen to be using for your web apps. There might be a framework or a library out there that already sort of helps solve this problem for you. So nowadays I do a lot of React work, and in the React world, there's a little project called React Window that basically lets you create these sort of virtual lists without you having to do all that math that Twitter was doing by yourself manually. There are also libraries. So I work as a developer advocate on Kendo React. It's a product we make here at Progress. And so a lot of our tools that are more advanced, we build virtual scrolling into automatically. So this is our grid, and grids are things that a lot of companies throw way too many rows into. They have a lot of data. So we offer as an option, we'll virtualize the scrolling for you so that you can do crazy things, and we'll do the math on keeping track of the rows for you. So I'd encourage you, regardless of the implementation, if you are building apps that have large lists of data, to look into virtualizing them, especially if you do any sort of mobile support on your apps at all, because on the web, if you do nothing by default and you just show these giant lists of data, they will really slow down your apps. And I think it's funny, as I was researching this, I found this example from Reddit that I just thought was interesting, and I thought I'd point it out. So on Reddit, if you go there on the web, they actually list infinite scroll as a feature of their native app. So they tell you, hey, if you want infinite scroll, they sort of punt on the implementation on the web. They say, if you want to be able to keep scrolling, you've actually got to download our native app. And they really want you to do it because they include 2 different banners for the native app. So they're sort of desperate because, again, it gets back to, why do these companies plug their native apps so heavily? Is because they can create these more performant lists. And they know that if you're looking at a more performant experience, you're going to click more, you're going to see more ads, they make more money. So that's why they're putting these very overt things in you to try to get you to convert. But I would encourage you to say, if you're building for the web, this doesn't need to be a feature that is exclusive to native. I do think it's kind of interesting, though, just to sort of be cognizant of the fact of, if you've ever wondered to yourself, why do lists feel so much better on native apps than they do on the web? It's because native developers have just a shortcut, because these platforms are providing an API that makes it easy for them. And on the web, the default experience is not that. You sort of have to go out of your way and do a little bit of extra work to create the same thing, which you can do. I showed the Twitter example just as one instance of something that you can do, but you do have to take that extra step to create a list that feels really good on the web. All right, so that was my first tip. List scrolling performance, extremely important. And I list that up front just because, like I said, so many apps are basically all they are lists, especially when you start to talk about mobile. So that's something that I think not a whole lot of web developers necessarily think about, but it's sort of a cornerstone to native iOS and native Android development. All right, so tip 2, testing on real physical devices matters. And I like including this one because if you're like me, and you can tell me if this is your mobile testing workflow, if I am building an app for the web and I need to test it on mobile to make sure it looks good on phones, usually my shortcut is I'll do something like I'll go into Chrome. So Chrome has this little button that lets you like simulate a mobile device, and I'll check to make sure my app looks good there. I might load my app up on my like personal device, right? To just say like, oh, okay, yep, it loads up and it looks good there. As long as it meets that basic check, I'll say like, oh yeah, looks good, right? What could go wrong on all the other like myriad of devices out there, right? It worked on my phone, so we should be good to ship this thing. And what I've learned from Nativescript, where we sort of, by the nature of building a framework that had to work on basically every mobile device out there, is that you run into some weird things across a variety of different mobile devices that are out there. And these are things that can actually matter for your app's performance and basically the way your app works. So I'm going to give you 2 reasons why you might care to actually test on real devices versus using some sort of simulators that just sit on your desktop machine. So the first is performance. So this is a benchmarking tool called Jetstream 2, which basically is just a fancy test that runs a whole bunch of like computational JavaScript and gives you a number where the bigger number is better. Basically, if you get a big number, that means you do JavaScript really good, really fast, essentially. And you can actually try this. If you just Google Jetstream 2 on your browser, you can play around with it and see what sort of numbers you get. And I found it interesting testing this, especially with mobile devices. And I was actually kind of shocked that my iPhone got a better score on this than my desktop Chrome machine did. It's actually kind of a testament to how good like really modern really like high-end devices can do on these sort of tests. And as developers, chances are the device you're going to be using to test your own web apps is going to be significantly nicer than your average user. Just us being software developers, we generally have pretty decent tech laying around. But if you take this benchmarking test and you try to run it on older devices, you find that things can degrade fairly quickly. So I had some tests where some of my devices I was getting in the low single digits, and then I had all the way down to my iPhone 5, which I've got sitting over there somewhere, that just like couldn't even finish the test. It started it, it just gave up and then refreshed the page automatically. And these performance issues on these older devices really does matter. And there are some things you can do to simulate this without a real device. So in the Chrome DevTools, there is a performance tab. And on this performance tab, you can simulate, you might have seen this before, slow network. So if you want to say, what is this like if my user's on a really slow network? But you can also simulate slow CPU as well. So if you wanted to see if they're on like a really low end device, what is this going to look like? You can simulate that in Chrome as well. And it works okay, but to me, it's not quite the same as actually sort of feeling the frustration that comes from having a slow experience in your hand. And actually the bigger reason, so I mentioned performance, but the biggest reason I'd encourage you to just acquire a few devices and have them around for testing just really anything you build for the web is you tend to find some interesting usability quirks just from using websites. And I'd actually be curious for this group. So I'm convinced that every user, everybody who owns a phone has some pet peeve about the mobile web. And I'd be curious what everybody else's is, because I'm going to share mine. But like everybody's got some device and there's something about the mobile web that comes up and that they hate. So I'll share mine first and I'll ask the group here whether they have any. So I have two. I probably have more than that, but I put two in the slide deck. So we'll go with that. So my first is, if you're an iOS user, you might know that there's this banner that is built into iOS that gives basically apps a way of plugging their native iOS app. So Reddit here is saying, hey, we have an iOS Reddit app. You might want to get it from the App Store, and putting it in here. The problem is about like half of apps do not account for the layout shift that happens here. So for example, Reddit is trying to plug something for me in this banner, right? But because this banner, this thing shows up off here, this thing gets displayed off the page. And then when I scroll, it sort of like janks into view in a really odd and disturbing way. And this banner, like, I swear, like, even you think like Twitter would be good enough to handle this, but, and this is a GIF, so it'll start over. This banner is here. And when I try to hit the share a tweet button, notice when this thing first comes up, there's no way of canceling it out. And then when I try to like scroll to get to the cancel button, it like juts into place, and it's a really weird experience. And this is Twitter, right? Like, this isn't like some rinky-dink little website. Like, you know, these people have engineers. Presumably they're on iPhones testing these things out, and they're still not accounting for this banner correctly. And my other pet peeve is just tiny touch targets, things that like you just can't hit at all. So I have decently sized fingers. That might be part of this as well. But so I've started cataloging these things because I'm a nerd and I give talks like this. So on CNN the other day, I was trying to hit this button and I just couldn't for the life of me do it. Like I had like a 33% success rate. And so being a nerd, I dove into the DevTools and I was like, well, why can't I hit this thing? And it turns out the button was 24 by 24 pixels. And to give you a sense of that, Apple, their sort of human interface guidelines suggest minimum targets of 44 by 44. So this is like somewhere around half of that. So I can't hit this. And actually, so I found this on Discord as well. Discord has a similar hamburger menu, and it's actually big enough. This is supposedly 40 by 45 or something like that. But if I play this, you'll see how this little bit is flickering here. Every flicker is me trying to hit this button. And you'll see at times I'm hitting this like 2 or 3 times, and I have no idea why, but this menu won't actually open. It's really, really weird. And I have in here like guidelines, like Apple recommends 44 by 44 pixels. But outside of all of this, the thing that frustrates me the most is I feel like if these developers that were behind these apps actually like opened these apps up on a variety of devices. There's no way they could have missed this, like at least in my mind. Like, these are things that are so obvious that when you're actually looking at the phone and trying to use it, but you'd also not catch these things through a simulator, because you go back to this button, you're not missing these buttons with a mouse on your desktop, right? You're just going to click them and get out of your way. It's not till you're actually holding it and trying to use this type of thing that you notice the problem. Same thing with this sort of banner back here on the Mac. In your Chrome simulator, it's not going to show this native banner. It's not something you're going to get to happen unless you're actually trying this thing on the device and experiencing the app exactly as your users would. So my broader tip is to test on real devices. And this is actually a set of devices we had for Nativescript, just because, like I said, we were building a framework, so we had to have a little bit of everything. But one of the questions I get lots of times when I talk about this is, well, which devices should I get, right? Because there's an absolute ton of options. You're never going to be 100% sure of what devices you need to have to test on. So I usually give I have a like pragmatic version to how you could approach actually testing your apps. And the first thing I would encourage you to do is just check your analytics, see what devices people are actually coming to your site on. So Google Analytics in particular is quite good about logging this. And you might find some, I think the thing to look for would be any sort of like outlier data that's specific to whatever it is you are building on the web. So I got a couple examples. So this is actually for the Progress blogs. And you'll see this is just mobile device usage. And you'll see that strangely, we have Windows tablets coming in as the second most popular device. The reason for this is because Progress through Telerik, we have a long history in the .NET world. So we have a disproportionate amount of really big Windows fans that access our site. And as such, our Windows tablet users are way more than you'd expect on an average website. But what that tells me is if I'm the person developing on this blog, then I probably should open the blog up. I should have a Windows tablet around to actually test this thing out on, because, hey, we have a whole lot of users that are using this thing to access our devices. So another one, sort of a counterexample, is with my wife, we are standard poodle owners. My wife, I was wondering if my dog was in here, but she used to breed standard poodles, and we have a website we run around standard poodles. Very random fact about me. But you'll see from the analytics behind this standard poodle site that standard poodle owners tend to also be iPhone fans. The Venn diagram between those two things is almost a complete overlap, which means if I'm developing for the standard poodle site, I better check this out in an iPhone or an iPad to see what this thing looks like, because that's where the majority of our audience coming to this site is actually using. So I'd encourage you to check your analytics, identify a few popular devices, maybe 2 or 3, maybe one that's like a higher end device, one that's a lower end device. And then I'd encourage you to just buy those devices. So I know like sometimes this is hard in certain corporate environments where there's like red tape in place in terms of making purchases, but I found it to be a pretty good investment. And what I usually do is actually just buy these things off of eBay. So you can find, if you're willing to get like a used or refurbished or broken phone, which is totally fine for mobile testing, because you don't need something brand new to just like load your website up on. You could just it's probably actually better if you get a used device, because it's more, I guess, authentic to what your users are actually using. So you can find these things for a few $100, and at least in my opinion, it's well worth your while to do so. And then finally, just test your apps on these devices periodically. And for this bit, it sort of depends on how important mobile is to what you're doing. If you're building apps that are sort of entirely enterprise and are only going to be used on desktop devices, maybe occasionally on a tablet, and you really don't need to worry about this too much. Maybe it's something you check occasionally. But on the flip side of this, if you're building a site that's primarily used on mobile, or is that a publicly accessed site, maybe this is something that you want to do, bring up the app on your devices every release or so, just to make sure things are working correctly. It's sort of something you have to gauge based off of what you're doing. All right, but in general, my tip there is that real devices do matter. You will catch things, trust me, that you wouldn't catch just on sort of simulator. There's something unique about trying to use an app that you're holding in your hands that you find little UX issues that I don't think you would find otherwise. All right, so at this point, we're on to tip number 3. So we've talked about list scrolling performance being very important. We've talked about testing on real devices matters. Actually, I did mean to ask the group after that, does anybody else have any mobile web pet peeves, things they don't like about the mobile web?
You got 2 of my worst ones. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to go 2 small buttons.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm really annoyed when I'm on a website on my phone and I hit an input element or a text area, and then iOS just zooms in.
Oh,
I
yep.
just can't see anything. It's probably not a web thing. That's pretty much iOS.
Well, no, because what
Sorry.
iOS will do is there's a minimum font size. If your font size of your input is below a certain point, iOS thinks it needs to zoom in. So it's another thing that falls into that bucket of like, if the developers if you're testing in Chrome, you wouldn't know that because it won't do the zoom. But if you test on your device, you know, oh, I need to bump up the font size of my input so that it doesn't do that thing.
Yeah, it just
Yeah.
it's like It's really
I know my pet peeve is also buttons, and my hands are tiny. I have to use my fingernails sometimes on some of those links. It's like, So I can imagine what someone with larger hands would feel.
I think the other one too that comes to mind is when ads or something loads in and it causes things to
Oh.
shift. So you go to click on a button and then like an
And it
ad
moves.
just loads
Oh.
and it moves. Yeah.
Or it
it's
just takes
like,
over the entire page.
Yep.
It's hard to get out.
Yeah, the little like you've read 2 articles like just popping right up like, and then it has a cancel button that's like teeny tiny.
I've had it with the keyboard tray popping up and hiding the content that you're trying to interact with sometimes.
Yeah, I've seen that one too. And I think it's crazy too, because it's funny because when we compare, you see lots of talks about the web versus native and which one's better. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, but I run in like, certainly there's pet peeves I have with native apps too, right? There are bad practices there too. But I find the mobile web, and I'm not totally sure why, to have more of these little frustrating things that pop up for whatever reason. So I'm still not exactly sure why, because I'm still convinced, like I said, I'm a longtime web developer. I'm convinced that the web is a perfectly fine platform for building these things. So it's frustrating to me that so many of these like irritating things are still in place.
another one. When mobile Safari, if you have a video or audio element that doesn't play through Safari, it plays through QuickTime and has a completely different set of behaviors and restrictions behind it that you won't necessarily run into if you did it on in Chrome or in a regular browser.
Yep, I have hit that one also. All right, I'm glad it's not just me. Like it's funny, I put that out there and I'm glad I got some responses. Cool, I'll have to ask after the next one too, so the next one I have on my list is subtle animations. So I'll encourage you to think of some animations you like from different applications, but I'll get into my tip here. So I think actually it makes sense. I have a quote in here that I like to start with. So this is from, if you're familiar with the name Jacob Nielsen, like he's sort of one of the like gods of UX, and he formed a group around UX. And this is a quote that I really like from his blog. I don't think it's written by him, but somebody on his team. But quote is essentially, when UI animations are subtle, unobtrusive, and brief, they can improve the user experience and communicate feedback and state changes, prevent disorientation, and strengthen signifiers, which to me is a fancy way of saying when UI animations are subtle, they can improve the user experience, right? Just little subtle things that can make your app feel a little bit nicer. And I bring this up in the context of this talk because I found that native apps, and again, for whatever reason, I don't necessarily have the answer for this one, but native apps tend to use these sort of animations more than web apps do. And so I have a few examples of this. So this is the Twitter native iOS app, and I've slowed this down, but what I'm about to do is hit the new tweet button. And you'll see I get this nice drawer animation that comes up. I get this second animation where the keyboard goes into place. And I'm going to hit the cancel button here in a second, and you'll see I get the exact same animation that happens where this thing is going to go down to the bottom of the screen. And I'll play this one more time because you can see even on this button press, I get this really simple, like, I don't know if you could see that, but the button went like in and out, just a tiny amount. And like I said, this is slowed down. So in real time, this doesn't feel obtrusive at all. It feels just like a nice little subtle thing that shows me where this UI came from, where it's going back to. It gives me feedback to let me know I successfully hit that button. So if I switch over to the web version of this on Twitter, you'll see this happen kind of fast, even when I slowed this down. So I will play this one more time. But I want you to notice how they're trying for the same animation, but it just feels a little more janky. So I'll play this one more time and just notice how when things come up, instead of smoothly going, like there's a few UI elements that like sort of jump into place. So you'll see like that, like for a second, that bottom bar showed up like very strangely. The same thing from the top. Actually, the same thing happens in reverse when I back out of this to cancel here in a second. So they try for the same thing, but the implementation is just janky for whatever reason. They don't actually do the button thing at all. They just sort of give up on that altogether. So sometimes I find that web apps try for the same animations, but don't do them as well on the web. And sometimes web apps just straight up don't do the same animations that the native ones do. So this is the native YouTube app for iOS. And I actually love this feature, but basically you can take a video and sort of drag it down to the bottom of the screen, and it'll play on the bottom half and let you multitask. So you can have that playing and you can do other things in the app. You can look around, you can read comments and other things. And other video apps do this as well. Twitch lets you do this. For example, you can drag a video down and sort of peruse around the rest of the application. You go to YouTube on the web though, and not only is that feature just straight up not there, but you get this like really sort of disorienting thing where like, I don't even know what exactly happens here, where like I try to scroll and I can't do it. And I get this weird like black space, and it's really kind of strange. And I think the reason this is frustrating to me is like, as someone that's a proponent of the web, like the web is totally capable of doing these sorts of things. It's not like native has some enormous processing power advantage. And there are some examples of web apps that I think do this sort of thing fairly well. So this is actually, I'll show the native example first. This is the native iOS Photos app. And this is actually, I think, my favorite example of an animation that enhances the user experience. Because if you haven't used this before, essentially you view a photo in this app. And if you flick down on it, it does this really subtle animation where essentially it takes the photo and it puts it back. It's like jigsaws it back in place. But if you think about it as a user, it helps give you context, because when you go back to the list, you're like, oh, that's where I was in the list of these things. So now I can continue looking at these photos. And to Apple's credit, if you go to iCloud.com, which is sort of the web equivalent of this, you can essentially do the exact same thing. So the UI isn't quite as nice in terms of how they display it, but they have the exact same animation in place, and it really works basically as well as the native app does. And I should also mention too, I'm more of an iOS person, but Google Photos actually has the same animation, both on native and also on the web as well. Like a lot of things, iOS or Android, one of them stole from the other. I don't know who did it first, but they tend to steal good ideas from each other. So the same thing is in place there as well. So you can do these animations on the web. And so I don't know why web developers don't reach for or try to make these animations happen more often. And so I don't have too much of like a specific implementation tip, other than I'd encourage you just to be cognizant of this fact and sort of pay attention as you use your device, as you use native apps. Just sort of notice things like, oh, hey, that was kind of cool what it did there. And think about those things and try to bring some of those things over to the web. And I do have one library recommendation. There's this tool called Lottie that I don't know if you've heard of before. It was done by Airbnb. And it's pretty popular for native iOS and Android developers. And they've recently, I don't think super recently, but they brought it over to the web as well. And essentially they're little animations that you can add to your apps, just like tiny little things, right? Like see, like you might have actually recognized like some of these things for some of the native apps that you do. And what makes them interesting is these are animations that are actually defined in JSON files, and there's a bunch of them that you can download from Airbnb. So if you're thinking about adding some sort of animation, but you don't know how to do the actual, like, how am I going to actually make this work? Lottie is an interesting library to look into and to see there's a chance somebody already did the work for you to create these animations and put them out there. I do want to give like one caveat because I feel to be responsible, I shouldn't just tell everybody, just use animations, go crazy, what could go wrong? Because if I go back to this same quote, there's one sentence afterwards that says, they, animations, should not be overused as they can easily become overwhelming and distract users. Because I think all of us at some point have used a native iOS or Android app from some developer that really drank the animation Kool-Aid and like went over the top, right? And things are buzzing and whirling all around when it's not really necessary. So as you're sort of just paying attention to the sort of animations that you like, think about whether it's something that's an animation for animation's sake or something that's actually making the user's life better. Is it providing some sort of feedback, some sort of context around how your app works as well? And
I started to write the user interface guidelines for LunaOS, and one of the guidelines I said is that you should make them feel like a well-oiled machine, not like bumper cars, because it's supposed to actually, help the user get work done.
Yeah, no, totally agreed. And if anybody has any other examples, because I like building, sometimes like this is one of those things that I like including like examples and videos because it's almost impossible to just explain through words. It's like easier to just show the animations. So if anybody else can think of other animations they like in different apps, I'd be curious to know too. And sometimes like I had when I first was creating this slide deck, I put this in here and then I just had to try to like pay attention on my phone. I just started going through and using apps to try to find ones I like, because really the ones that are done super well, you almost don't even notice because they really are so fast and quick. They're not like overt, right? There's not fireworks going off. It's just really subtle things that don't get in your way at all. So I have one more point on this tip, and this one is perhaps even the strangest to me. That's the topic of sound. So at some point, someone, I don't know who this important person was, but someone decreed that there should be no sound on the web. Essentially, if you're building a game, you can have sounds. Obviously, if you're showing like a movie or something, you can have sounds. But you're not really going to find an app that plays any sort of sound when you click a button or you do really anything within the app. And I'm not totally sure why that is, because there are plenty of native apps that use sound in one way or another. And I can try to show, I don't think this mic will pick up on it, but even like little subtle things. So I'll crank this, you probably won't be able to hear it, but on like Twitter, for example, probably not loud enough to hear, but there's just a tiny little pull to refresh sound when you pull to get more tweets. And Facebook does this too. And Facebook does it on the pull to refresh. Again, don't know if you can hear, but they actually show you hear like a little bell for notification there. And that wasn't the global like phone notification, that was within the Facebook app. And they also play just a little sound. This one you definitely won't be able to hear, but they play like a little tap sound when you click a button within the Facebook app. And again, it's not like obtrusive, right? This thing is not belling and whirling at you, but it gives the user some amount of feedback. And I just find it interesting that the web like straight up doesn't do this. And not all native apps do that, right? It's just a handful here or there, but some of the really big ones do. So I know that a friend of mine, Brian Rinaldi, and he feels pretty strongly about this. So I'm going to link to a blog post he wrote about this that goes into more detail that I'm going to. But he basically lays out some ideas of things where you might actually want to consider sound on the web. So things like the notifications would be one. If you need something pops up and you want to get the user's attention. Air conditions are another one. Like if something's disabled and the user tries to do something with it, you can play a little something like, again, like really subtle. You don't want it to annoy people, but it's a quick way of giving feedback to users that they did something either right or wrong within your application. So this one's potentially controversial. I don't know what everybody here thinks about it, because I know there are some diehards that like the sound will come to the web over their dead bodies. But I actually kind of like them in native apps. So I'd be curious what other people think about it as well. Do you like when apps play sounds? Do you hate it? Yeah.
So I have a lot of opinions on this. There's a movement now to like just go for auto playing media to have it always mute, and that's it. That's just gonna be the policy, which in my opinion is not correct, because there are valid use cases where you might want to play autoplay sound, and it would have been a better idea to have some sort of built-in into the browser web API to allow a site to say, hey, I'm providing an interactive experience. And so the example that I use is giving feedback to students if they've answered something correctly or incorrectly. And a lot of times I want to play an incorrect sound, and then immediately after play an explanation, and a very specific explanation for the thing they've done incorrectly. And you cannot do that in Chrome, because you can't play audio in sequence. It's all based off a gesture now. So you basically now have code that says do one way or the other. And in iOS, all you have to do is have a button anywhere that plays an empty sound, and you can do as much as you want from there. But I love that bug. Anyways, I'm gonna stop ranting right now. But yeah, I think it's a very interesting discussion, because on the other hand, you don't want to have embedded MIDIs like we did in the 90s.
Yeah, I think unfortunately, like the other one is like no one likes auto playing ads with audio either too. So I think like those have sort of ruined it for everybody, because now, I mean, that's my guess is that's why Chrome does it, is because people get upset that like Cadillac starts talking to them when they're just trying to look at a sports score sort of thing. And so that sort of ruins the fun for everybody.
TJ,
So it's all those.
Sorry.
I was going to say it's all those Angel Fire developers from the 90s making pages about their sports teams that have ruined it for everyone else. TJ.
Oh yeah. I totally did autoplay music back in the day, but I did it when it was cool, so it was okay.
Very nice.
Yeah, TJ, one of the things I like the sound and even the animations made me think about this. So I've never actually developed at all with native apps, completely web. But I think something even with animations and sound, I think there's something that people have expectations about how the web will behave and how a native app will behave. And so or even the cost, so I'm thinking we did something where we were trying to smooth scroll down to a different point, and we were trying to lazy load images, and it was just an absolute nightmare. Whereas I think in native tools there's easier ways to do that. So maybe that's the resistance towards changing those expectations. But yeah, I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, it's like I think native does have animations are a bit easier on native. And I think the reason is because there's not the legacy of the DOM in place. Because when you're trying to do the smooth scrolling, you're essentially forced to use like DOM APIs that were dreamed up in the late 90s or early 2000s. And smart people at like Chrome and such have done a lot to help make that better, but there's still some wonkiness that you can't totally overcome. So I think some of that is true. It kind of depends on how crazy you're getting, I think. Because in iOS, you do have a bit more control just because it's not DOM based. You have a totally different layout mechanism. So I think you can get away with more there. But it's also not like, I still get impressed by people that do really fancy things on iOS and Android apps, because it's not like it's super easy there either, because I mentioned this at some point, but this talk is like focusing heavily on the positives of iOS and Android. And there's also some really, really wonky and bad things about iOS or Android as well. So there's a different set of challenges, but I do think animations are a little easier to just pull off just because the DOM isn't there.
So I was thinking, I think part of the reason why you see more sounds on iOS apps and you don't see them on websites is that you get the act of downloading an app sort of gives the app creator more liberties with what they can expect their user to tolerate. Like I've chosen to download the Twitter app. Twitter knows that I want their thing. And so it's less intrusive than if I just go to some website, which could be some rando website on a link I clicked, maybe unfortunately from, I can't get to his name now. Anyhow, your coworker that sends links to people. Ed.
Yeah.
Why couldn't I get to Ed's name? Anyhow, so you get some rando link that you maybe might want to click, or some website that you've Googled, and then all of a sudden it starts making noise. That's very intrusive. But when I go to Twitter, it's not intrusive because I asked for Twitter.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, because the web, you sort of have to almost assume the least common denominator. Like anybody could pop in here for whatever random reason.
Yeah, so there's just more. I'm more bought into Twitter than I am the website that shows up in my Google search. So Twitter can take more liberty. I think that's some of it.
Actually, I think I'll use that as a segue, because getting into my last tip here about minimizing asset downloads actually plays into exactly that point of downloading from the apps. And actually, I'll just jump straight into this, because to me, one of the things that comes up all the time, I'm sure everybody's here has read some articles at some point, but native versus web in terms of performance. And my take on this, at least in the context of this talk, is a little bit different. So I'll just read this. Basically, when native apps load, so I got the Twitter app from the iOS App Store or Google Play, I hit the button. That app has all the code and the assets it needs. So like, for example, if I have a sound file from Twitter, it's packaged up with that app that the user downloads, and I don't have to like download it on the fly like I would have to on the web. And so although you might need to hit the network to load data, like Twitter needs to go get tweets because the tweets aren't baked into the binary code. Twitter doesn't need to go to the network to hit the app code to get the code itself. And to me, this is like the single biggest reason why native apps are considered quote unquote faster than web apps, is because that download happens as like a one-step thing that the user does. And oftentimes they auto update that app, so they don't even realize it's updating in the background. And the app just has everything it needs to do what it does. And I think this is a little bit easier to explain by showing it again. So I made a couple of videos of, let's say I want to use the ESPN app. So what I did is I downloaded the ESPN app. This is fresh from the App Store, never before opened. So an icon shows on my home screen. And when I open this thing, you'll note that it took a second for this sort of stories. ESPN has to go out to presumably some API they have to say what's the stories I should feature and list down here. But notice how the shell of the app was there, like essentially just instantaneously, right? So as soon as I open this, I have like the bars for the app, the navigation, it's all there. It's all ready to go, because that was all part of the binary that the user downloaded from the App Store. And the sort of equivalent of that on the web. So again, I want to do ESPN. I want to get my sports scores. So I go to my browser. I've got a clear cache. I go to ESPN.com and I load this thing. And you'll see that there's a couple seconds delay before I hit anything at all. And then once I do, there's another gap between I start to see the stories and then I start to see the images. So the difference here is that ESPN on the web can't just immediately show you its navigation, because it's got to go to the network to get the code to render the navigation and then actually paint that on the browser. And I think it's just important to be, I guess, cognizant of this, because if you are working on a web app and you're ever told like, well, hey, the native version, this thing loads instantaneously, you're fighting an uphill battle. It's almost like you're doing a 400-meter race, one lap around the track, and your competitor is already on like the other end of the straightaway, right? Because they've sort of got an intrinsic advantage to how these applications work. And I should also mention too that this example I did on the web was kind of a best case scenario because I'm on a high-end device here and I'm also on Wi-Fi. So I busted back out my trusty old iPhone 5 to load ESPN.com. And you'll see when I do it on this device, and this is again still on Wi-Fi, so I'm still on a really good network. And when I load this, you see it takes probably a good 6 or 7 seconds before I see anything at all. And then these other bits have to chunk out because again, it's going out to the network to get each and every piece of this. Whereas in the binary app, a lot of these things are just packaged in there. These aren't things that you have to go to the network to go out and get. So again, my point here is not necessarily like, I think it's just like trying to tell people to just be aware of that fact. I think that's why in our brains, we tend to associate native apps as being fast, is because that download, we don't think about the like 100, 200 megs that we downloaded while doing something else. All we think about is, hey, I hit the icon and something happened really, really fast. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do anything about this. So I'm not going to get into like a full performance talk because we could spend an entire hour on that itself. But I will link to a few different resources that I think are good tools to help mitigate this sort of thing, because the less code that you ship, and especially the more you're able to cache. So these examples of the web did look kind of bad, but I was also running them without any cache whatsoever. And if I am able to cache a lot of these resources, things get better, not quite as good as native, but they do load a little bit snappier because these files are being retrieved from memory and not having to go out to the network. So I do have a few links. These are just things that I recommend. If you are fairly new to performance on the web, Google has a pretty good like 101 level write-up that's here. Service workers and really just good old-fashioned cache headers are a good thing to be familiar with as well. And they have a good write-up there. And then if you've never used Lighthouse before, it's a tool that's built into Chrome that can help provide some sort of automated ways of testing how well you're doing these things. So that's another one that I would check out as well. But I mostly mentioned this as just sort of just being aware of the fact, like just because in my head, it's funny how when you're working on native apps, you almost don't even need to think about that initial load. And sometimes like you see the bad end of that is you also will see like, especially iOS developers that just throw all sorts of things in their binary. Like I swear, like the iOS app updates I get nowadays are like starting to see like 300, 400 megs, and you start to wonder, what are you throwing in there? But you can kind of get away with murder in native app land, because whereas on the web, we're like micro optimizing how many kilobytes am I going to ship in my bundle. In iOS, it's like, yeah, just throw it in there. Like they won't even notice, right? Just keep adding to it. Because unless you're in a market where that data is actually quite constrained, Facebook is shipping a several hundred meg app, and that certainly isn't stopping them and stopping millions of people from using it. So those are my 4 tips. So list scrolling performance, it's super important to be able to scroll lists fast. Testing on real physical devices matters. I'd encourage you to get a few devices for testing. Again, pay attention to animations just as you're using your phone. I'd be curious the sort of things that you find, and just to be cognizant of the fact that native apps have a bit of an advantage in terms of that early load time. And I do have one bonus tip to wrap up with. This is a quick one, and it's to just give iOS and Android development a shot, especially if you're a person that primarily does the web or JavaScript and never dipped your toes in. It's kind of it's an interesting thing to just spend a little bit of time and familiarizing yourself with. It's I don't think you need to like go full all in and like build the next great iOS app or anything like that. You can just go in and build a to-do list and get a hold of these platforms and see what they can do. But I really do think it's the same sort of thing that you'll see encouraged in programming all the time, right? Like toy with another language, because it gives you a different perspective on how you approach problems. I think the same is true from UI, just from seeing how iOS and Android approach the same problems of how do you lay out UI components? How do you show them on the screen? And I focus mostly on the positive things. You've gotten like the best possible view of iOS and Android. I painted them in a really nice light by focusing on that. but there is some nasty stuff on iOS and Android. You actually, I've come to appreciate the web more just because the publishing process in iOS and Android is awful, like really, really awful. Dealing with the App Store is a nightmare. You really come to respect the web of like, hey, I get a single URL. I can like hit a button. Like literally everybody has web servers you can host your apps on. So you get just a different perspective on what things you like and what things you don't like. So if you haven't before, I'd encourage you just build some stupid little thing that you think is interesting. Like I said, I don't think you have to build anything crazy. And if you're more of an Apple fan, try iOS. More of an Android fan, you can try Android Studio. I think either is fine for experimenting with. But yeah, any questions of anything that we haven't gotten to at this point?
Well,
I guess.
Go ahead. Go ahead, John.
My question was dealing with. I'm a web developer, and there's definitely been conversations in the past where I've been getting into gridlock in terms of talking with the community of people I work with where I work about making the products we have available in a mobile web environment. And the conversation always goes either should we take the app we have right now and using whatever we need to make essentially the same. Some people say we should build a mobile website for the mobile experience, and some people say just use the actual website you have and using frameworks or media queries or whatever, have it adjust to fit the device that's hitting it. But we usually get locked into those two different camps, and nobody makes a decision, so it doesn't end up going anywhere.
Yeah, those are hard. I think it depends a lot on the complexity of what you're building. I always lean towards trying to make what you have work just because it's so much easier than creating something. Because as soon as you fork and create like a mobile dot or a different experience, that creates a whole lot of work down the line because now you have two different things that you're maintaining. That being said, there are certainly cases where it makes sense, especially if your existing web app is super complex. Like think like Facebook, for example. Facebook on the desktop, you have all sorts of things everywhere. And when you go on your mobile phone, this UI is simplified greatly, right? You're just focusing on the bits that people on mobile care about. But obviously Facebook has 1 billion engineers and $1 trillion budget or whatever, right? So they can afford to create super optimized experiences for their users, and they can make money off of doing that. It's a lot harder for your just average developer at your average company to create that. So I always lean towards just making what you have work on mobile and try to work with media queries and such. But I do recognize that there is a level of complexity where that just gets to be rough. It kind of depends on how many people you have using it too, because actually I don't find using like full on desktop apps on my phone to be that awful. That's why I said it kind of depends on what you need to do. Because I've also ran into, I'm guessing other people have hit this as well, where sites that try to get a little too clever with like media queries, and they create a worse experience than it would be if you just could straight up use their full desktop app on your phone as well.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. I've sort of walked entirely around your question. So I don't know if that helps at all. I just know like I've actually been on both sides of the equation in previous jobs. And that's why I say I think I lean against creating two separate things, because I've seen firsthand how like you're doubling your maintenance in terms of it's a whole different app to support. So I'm really hesitant to go down that route unless it's something that there's a clear need for.
I think it's very similar to, your whole picture of UX and your user experience when you think about accessibility as well as search engine optimization. And if you split two sites out, you're going to have to, again, your code base just doubled. And when you when you're going for responsive design or going for mobile, think about it like accessibility. You want to provide the website so that it can be used by all people and be inclusive of from an accessibility standpoint, from a mobile standpoint, equity standpoint, and so that kind of all factors together. And so if you think about that when you're designing your user experience, it should help. You can provide a good user experience.
Thank you.
So I was thinking about all the performance things. The big advantage of the mobile app has is that you can just download everything. It's just all baked into the into the app file.
Yep.
And you're right about submitting apps to the App Store for iOS. My God, that's a brutal process. But I was thinking about that and thinking, the web is basically a document management thing that got turned into things that we build apps on. Yeah. So of course it's awkward, right? and it does have that sort of needs to be all things to all clients. And I was thinking, there's this thing called Webassembly. And I wonder if you could just take, I'm just thinking out loud here, but it struck me as an interesting idea. If you could just, in essence, compile your application into a WebAssembly module and get a performance boost that way in the same way that you do on mobile apps. So that you basically have a canvas that's the size of your screen, and the WebAssembly module's got compiled right into the OASM file. You have, the bitmaps and everything that need to be shown, everything, and you just get a full SDK like you would if you were doing an iOS application in WebAssembly.
Yeah, you could do it. You'd still have that straight up like on-demand download, I think, would still have to happen though.
Yeah, you would.
Because like you'd have to go to myapp.com or whatever, and it would have to know to download the WebAssembly code before it could do anything.
Yeah. You go like wasm.facebook.com and then, then it's, or app.facebook.com. And then first thing it does, you get is a little loading app. And then once it's loaded, it's cached. You don't have to do it unless it changes.
Yeah, I know.
Oh, go ahead.
The whole push behind like progressive web apps and service workers and such, that's sort of like the web's best attempt to go after that, because it basically says, hey, you're using this app and you can download it to your home screen. And then that gives you a place on the app that gives you an icon that downloads all the web code locally. And that does kind of work, but I don't think they've had the greatest in terms of adoption of it. Like, I know I like where they're headed with it, but I can also say I've never actually done that on my phone. I don't know if anybody else here has. So, I mean, I like the idea like on paper, but I don't know how many people are actually taking like progressive web apps and downloading them and using them. I haven't seen any good statistics on them in a while.
Yeah, I haven't either, actually. And I have to admit, I've never done that either. So
yeah.
Well, I take that back. There's a few, I did do it with like Google Docs and stuff like that, where I need to be able to access the Google Docs when I'm disconnected.
Okay.
But that's about it.
Any other questions about anything at this point?
Well, thank you. This was awesome.
Yeah, it was very good.
I put the talks up at this URL, and I probably shared through chat. I realized I picked a kind of a bad URL because these characters at the end aren't the easiest to read, but that's bit.ly Columbus-JS-TJ.
Excellent.
Okay.
Well, I haven't seen any questions on Twitch. We did have, I think, up to 4 viewers at one point, which is not bad for a small meetup in there, in the smaller Twitch stream. So again, thank you very much, TJ. We'll give you a big virtual round of applause. That was an excellent talk. It's actually made me think a lot about animations specifically in web apps, because that is a thing that I never think to do.
Yeah, it's funny
and
once you
it
start.
really does provide that feedback that you're not aware it's there until you start looking for it.
Yeah, that's why I said it's like one of those things you like if you try to think of them, you really won't. But if you start paying attention to it, it's funny how many little things you notice.
The same thing happens when you start doing video editing. And then
Oh,
you start,
yeah.
right? Because you're using After Effects to do some animation effects. And then you start watching YouTube videos and you're like, oh, yeah, oh, that's a neat trick. Yeah, that's a nice little effect they put there. You don't see it right off the bat. You just sort of, you subconsciously take it in and it provides data that you're not even aware you're using. It's you just have that sort of intrinsic feedback. And you're like, I don't know, I just seem to understand how this app works better. I don't know. You don't even realize why. And so
Yep.
I think that's the difference between a good app and a great app.
Yep.
So yeah, so you've made me think rethink about how I want to build things. So well done.
Cool.
So I'm going to go ahead and unshare your screen here.
All right.
I think I can do that. Can I? I think you just have to unshare it.
Okay.
I'm sure I could do it. I just can't remember how.
Yeah, I don't use okay, there's stop share.
There we go. Cool. So again, thank you very much. I'm going to go ahead and if there's any other questions or any other riveting conversation anyone wants to engage in, I'm going to go ahead and kill the stream, but and then we can hang around for a bit and talk some more if you like. That is always welcome and cool. Oh, there are more questions. I see Doug and Matthew have their hands up.
I think we had the same question, Doug. Go ahead.
One point I wanted to make was that native widget libraries have the advantage of being a standard widget library per platform, or nearly standard. I think there's more than one for Android. And on the web, since we're using different frameworks, each widget needs to be written for each framework. And for example, I wrote some animated widgets for the Enyo framework some years ago. And they were great if you were using Enyo, but if you're using React, they're of no use whatsoever.
Yeah, I feel this firsthand because at Progress we do Kendo UI, and so we got started with jQuery widgets, and that was great, and they're still around. People still use them, but then jQuery became not the cool thing anymore. So we ended up writing them for Angular and then Vue and then React. And so now all of a sudden we have 4 different libraries that we're maintaining, and all of them there's some bits of sharing between them for like some of the underpinnings, but for the most part, there are 4 different libraries because, well, if you're using React, you want something that's actually built like with React and that works like you'd expect a React thing to work, which means like just the sheer maintenance load on it is kind of nuts. But we've also come to terms with it as like a business reality. But you're right, on iOS, there are like some frameworks in iOS, but there's nothing like the React, the JavaScript framework craziness we have on the web. There's nothing like that. So you can basically truly write a widget that's just coded to iOS or to Android. I guess that is the one complication is lots of people try to build native apps cross-platform in one way. So you do kind of have 2 platforms because you've got to make iOS and Android try to work somewhat similar. Sometimes there's some because if you go like the React Native Nativescript route, there's a lot of plugins that try to be cross-platform. But then you have some people that just don't try cross-platform at all and just go like hardcore iOS, hardcore Android too. So there's a little bit of everything. But it is a good point. I never even thought about the fact that so much of the web's like work on some of these things gets poured into like silos essentially.
Matthew, you had a question, or was it the same question?
It was a different question. I wanted to know what's coming up next month, Guy.
Yes, our regular routine is I forget to mention what's coming up next month, and Matthew reminds me. We do this every month. So I do not have anything scheduled for January yet. I've got a couple different people. I've got several people that want to speak. There's someone in line first. I'm waiting for an answer. If I don't get an answer soon enough, I'll pick the next person in the line. In February, I do have a speaker scheduled. Rob Richardson will be joining us from Phoenix, Arizona. He's giving a talk, Vue.js and TypeScript, working together like peanut butter and jelly. So that should be a good talk. And I've got a lot of other people that have given me different talks, ideas, and it's in the process of getting 2021 figured out. If I don't, worst case, come January, if we don't have a talk scheduled, I'll give a talk. So I've always got one in my back pocket. So
where can I find this information when it's available?
You can find it at ColumbusJS.org. And I'll put it out on Twitter as well at the CBusJS Twitter account. And all those links will be in the YouTube video for those of us, or those of you who are watching on YouTube after the fact. So they'll all be in the description below. But I'm talking with several people, but Rob's the only one person I've actually slated into a time slot. So, I don't want to commit anyone else to a particular time yet. But I put a CFP out on Twitter and I got about 10 responses. So we should be good. Any other questions? Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and kill the stream. Thanks everyone on Twitch for watching. Thanks everyone on YouTube for watching as well. And everyone that's here with me on the Zoom, thanks for hanging out, and we'll hang out a little bit longer. So see you later. See you later, Twitch.